The quiet June morning of 2025 began with an unusual stir on the banks of the Mill River. 6 black FBI SUVs quietly parked in front of a small wooden cottage in suburban Milford, Connecticut. Neighbors drew their blinds slightly, watching as bulletproof-vested agents moved quickly around the property, the murmur of radio traffic humming in the damp, cool air. Inside, 80-year-old Donald James Sutter was making coffee, a habit he'd kept for years since being known as a quiet, reclusive man who always attended church on Sunday. The sharp knock came at 7:32 a.m. "We have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the disappearance of the Parlow sisters." Agents later recounted the moment his elderly hand trembled slightly as he set down the coffee mug, but his eyes remained unnervingly calm, as if he had known this day would come, only not that it would be 24 years late. Before we delve deeper into this shocking true story, let us know where you are watching from, and if you love journeys to find forgotten justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. In the summer of 2001, the coastal town of Milford, Connecticut, was steeped in cold white fluorescent light, and the smell of rain mixed with salt air from Long Island Sound. Inside the Value Town Supercenter, the public address system played a steady reminder for customers to prepare to leave the store, interspersed with the sound of shopping cart wheels on the floor and advertising music echoing from the ceiling speakers. Renee Parlow, a single mother of 3, stood in the discounted children's clothing section, carefully choosing each small garment. Her 2 eldest daughters, 8-year-old Charisse and 5-year-old Destiny, chirped as they ran around the cart, competing to choose shoes and toys. The youngest, Neva, sat in the cart, yawning, holding a crumb of a cookie. The late-day atmosphere was peaceful, with only a few hurried late shoppers remaining before closing time. As Renee checked the price tag, a middle-aged man with silver hair approached. He was tall, neat, wearing a plaid shirt, and spoke in a soft voice. He smiled kindly, asked the children a few questions, then turned to Renee, saying he had a gift certificate and wanted to help her buy a few extra items. He quietly mentioned that "My wife is coming later," and he just wanted to help a mother with small children. His composed voice and polite manner did not alarm Renee. She thanked him and continued selecting clothes, while the 2 girls listened to him tell stories about the store. A few minutes later, the man offered to take Charisse and Destiny to the McDonald's inside the supermarket to get burgers and wait for their mother to check out. Renee nodded, instructing her daughters to behave and follow him, then bent down to check the pile of items in her basket again. The 2 children held hands and followed him toward the brightly lit hallway. The silhouettes of the 3 figures gradually shrank amidst the flow of customers leaving the store. A moment later, the announcement that the store was about to close echoed. Renee looked up, looking around, but couldn't see her 2 daughters. She pushed her cart through the aisles, calling their names, her voice starting to tremble. The toy section, the shoe section, the McDonald's counter were all empty. The eating area's metal shutter was down, employees were mopping the floor, and the sound of the vacuum cleaner echoed in the cold space. Sweat soaked her palms, and she rushed back to the checkout counter, frantically asking every employee. They exchanged confused glances, saying they had seen the 2 girls with a man just a moment ago. Renee was stunned, a feeling of fear rising to choke her. She quickly ran out the main doors, looking around the parking lot under a light drizzle, the lights reflecting on the slick, wet pavement. There was no sign of the 2 children, only a few cars leaving the lot. She returned inside the supermarket, her hands shaking as she clutched the security desk. The night guard immediately locked the doors, announcing over the radio, requesting staff to check the entire area. Another security employee picked up the phone, dialing the emergency number to report to the police. In the watch room of the Milford Police Department, the clock showed nearly 11 o'clock at night when the phone rang loudly. Sergeant Lewis, the night shift officer, had just picked up a steaming cup of coffee when a panicked voice from the other end, the security guard from Value Town Supercenter, rang out. "We have 2 missing children, 2 little girls, who left the store with an unfamiliar man. The mother is here." Very distraught, Lewis immediately set down his cup, quickly typed a few notes, and transferred the call to the dispatch center. Within 5 minutes, 2 patrol cars were dispatched to the scene, blue and red lights, sweeping along the rain-slicked road leading into the shopping area. When the police arrived, the supermarket was almost empty. The security guard was waiting at the main entrance, his uniform jacket soaked, his face strained. He pointed inside, where the long aisles were submerged in cold white light. 2 little girls, and a man. They left through this door, about 15 minutes before I realized something was wrong. Police immediately ordered all doors to be sealed, the area cordoned off, and remaining staff to stay in place. Investigator Paul Rivers, head of the Milford Child Crimes Investigation Team, arrived quickly. He was a seasoned, taciturn man, accustomed to observing everything in silence before asking questions. As he stepped through the door, he paused for a few seconds to survey the scene, merchandise haphazardly displayed, checkout lights still on, and in the children's clothing section, an abandoned shopping cart with its bags wide open. His first feeling was one of anomaly, not a case of lost children, but a deliberate disappearance. Renee Parlow, the mother, was taken to the staff area by a female officer for reassurance. Her eyes were red, her hands shaking ceaselessly. Rivers silently observed, from a distance before asking briefly, "Who did the 2 girls leave with?" The answer was disjointed, but enough for him to form a picture. A middle-aged man with silver hair, neatly dressed, mentioned a gift certificate, and offered to help buy things. He said he would take the 2 girls to the McDonald's inside the supermarket to wait for their mother, then vanished. Police began checking the fast food counter, where the shutter was now down, with only a weak light reflecting on the wet tile floor. Staff here confirmed seeing an older man walking 2 little girls past, heading toward the north exit. This door led to the less trafficked back parking lot, and notably, had no outdoor camera coverage. Rivers immediately requested a check of all side alleys, restrooms and the delivery area. A team of technicians brought in scene cameras, numbering each area. At the clothing counter, the shopping cart became the first piece of evidence. Inside were a few new children's outfits, 2 pairs of sandals, an unpaid invoice, and Renee's handbag. Everything was sealed in plastic bags. Technicians checked for fingerprints and collected a few small scraps of paper from the basket. Near this area, the floor showed wet children's shoe prints, matching the size of Charisse and Destiny. The prints led toward the north exit, then stopped. In the security room, police collected tapes from the internal camera system. The old VHS heads were still running, the images blurry, but clear enough to see 3 small figures, 2 children, and a silver-haired man, leaving the store around. No signs of struggle, no rushing, no one paying attention. He stopped for a few seconds in front of the payment counter, looked at his watch, then quickly walked toward the door. He knew exactly when the store was about to close, Rivers murmured, his gaze fixed on the screen. Outside, the rain began to fall heavier. Another group of officers was sweeping the parking lot. Flashlights swept across hundreds of empty parking spaces, only to stop at a clear tire track on the wet asphalt. The track had a narrow gauge, typical of a mid-sized. The trace led to the exit onto Post Road, then disappeared. They marked the location, photographed the scene, and sent a quick report. Rivers returned to the staff break room. Renee sat motionless, her eyes vacant. He asked her one last time for a description of the suspect. Build, voice, accessories. She only shook her head, unable to recall clearly, only saying he seemed polite, not scary. Rivers closed his notebook, looked at his watch. Nearly midnight. He stepped onto the porch, rain beating on his jacket shoulder, the neon lights of the Value Town sign casting dark blue-red streaks onto the slippery road. He spoke briefly into the radio. Deploy a full area search, sweep all white vans registered within a 10-mile radius, and bring those videotapes back to headquarters immediately. A voice answered amidst the static of the rain. Understood, sir. In that cold, wet night, the first scene of the disappearance was locked down, the beginning of an investigation that would last more than 2 decades. Immediately after the supermarket scene was cordoned off, the Milford Police Department deployed search forces overnight. Wind from the sound brought with it the smell of damp salt and the distant wail of emergency sirens. Flashing police lights, lights on the water-slicked roads, painting dark blue-red streaks across the windows. Investigator Paul Rivers stood next to the patrol car, holding the radio, ordering the deployment of the K-9 unit in 2 directions. One group encircling the north parking lot, the other spreading out along Post Road, leading to the residential area by the Mill River. The two police dogs began sniffing from the north exit, where the camera last recorded the three figures leaving the store. On the damp concrete, the mixed scents car oil, trash, rain and dust made tracking difficult. However, after only a few minutes, both dogs reacted strongly at the low fence section bordering the auxiliary parking lot. There the mud was trampled and a faint tire track led to the small road behind. When the technical team shone lights, they discovered a few thin fibers clinging to the edge of the iron fence, possibly from children's clothing. The samples were cut and sealed, but when the canine dogs passed that area, the scent trail completely stopped. There was no further direction to follow. Rivers bent down, touching the soft mud near the fence, then looked up at the dark empty space behind the parking lot. He knew this was where the man had left. An officer reported there were no security cameras in this area, only streetlights, spaced nearly 50 meters. This meant the abductor had chosen the exact blind spot of the entire area. Around midnight, the dispatch center sent a report. A gas station 3 blocks east of Value Town had just provided a blurry video clip. In the frame, a white van, an older model Ford Econoline, drove past at about 10:45 p.m., heading toward Post Road. The taillights flickered unevenly, the license plate was unclear. Paul Rivers requested to enlarge the frame, but the VHS quality made the image grainy. Still, this was the first clue outside the supermarket. Patrol teams were distributed along Post Road, the main route connecting Milford with riverside towns like Bridgeport and Stratford. Rain reduced visibility, the road was slick, and the search became slow. Police knocked on the doors of open late-night stores, asking gas station attendants, delivery drivers, and homeless people around the old industrial area. No one had seen the two children or the silver-haired man. Meanwhile, at headquarters, the data processing center continuously cross-referenced the registration records of white vans within a 10-mile radius. The initial list had over 60 suitable vehicles, most belonging to transport companies or small delivery business. Each owner was called to confirm their location. Rivers knew that number was only the surface. The perpetrator could have used a fake license plate or a rental car under another entity's name. Around 2 in the morning, the K9 team returned to headquarters, reporting no further trace. The dogs all lost the scent at the same spot, the north fence. That meant the man had lifted or carried the two girls into the car right there. Rivers was silent for a few seconds, then said briefly, he had a plan, not a spontaneous. By 3 o'clock, neighboring police departments were asked for support. Milford wasn't large, but the routes out of town led in many directions. Interstate 95 towards New Haven, or the coastal road to Bridgeport. Temporary checkpoints were set up, patrol cars displaying child abduction, stay alert, warning signs. However, the bad weather and sparse night traffic made this effort almost fruitless. In the watchroom, a young officer was drafting an Amber Alert for the entire state. The system was still new in Connecticut, and most alerts had to be sent via fax and phone calls to each local precinct. When the first fax was printed, the machine jammed, delaying the signal by nearly 40 minutes. By the time the official alert was broadcast, most suburban police stations had ended their shifts. The warning was only received by a few areas that night. While the field forces continued the search, inside Value Town, the technical team had finished collecting evidence. Everything was labeled, photographed, and stored. A young officer handed Rivers a copy of the list, just a few purchased items, an unpaid invoice, and the empty shopping cart. No signs of a struggle, no blood, no drag marks. The entire scene was unusually clean. Too neat, Rivers said, his voice low, as if he had planned every step. Outside, the rain had just stopped. Cold, damp air rushed in as the automatic doors opened. Paul Rivers stepped onto the porch, looking toward the main road. The traffic lights blinked yellow, a few night trucks passing by. He knew that in just a few hours, Milford would wake up, and news of this disappearance would spread across the state. He pulled out his radio, speaking clearly, "Start opening the case file, case number 201 Mil 34. As the confirmation signal sounded in his earpiece, he looked back at the supermarket, its lights dimmed, the entrance deserted with only streaks of light reflecting on the wet floor. No one on the team knew then that they had just laid the foundation for one of the most prolonged and haunting missing persons cases in Connecticut history. And in the report sent the next morning, the final line was typed in bold: 2 missing minors, suspected abduction. The early morning dew blanketed the roads along the Mill River, and the moisture from the water, mingled with the smell of fresh earth, made the air thick. Search teams spread out across the suburban area of Milford, where the river cut through abandoned lots and old warehouses. The sporadic barking of police dogs, interspersed with the crackle of radios and the sound of boots sinking into the mud. They followed the direction of the blurred white van seen in the tape, hoping to find any sign left behind after the rainy night. Paul Rivers led the way, his eyes scanning quickly over every bush, every faint tire track pressed into the damp ground. The scenery was eerily quiet, only the steady sound of river water flowing below the bank and the chirping of insects in the wet grass. A searcher paused, calling out softly as he spotted something among the dry leaves. Lying sideways, in the mud, was a small purple plastic sandal, covered in sand and decayed leaves. Rivers bent down, using a pen to gently lift the strap, his eyes catching a tight, rigid crease. The technical team quickly cordoned off the area, took photographs, and collected soil samples. Not far from that location, along the trail leading to the wooden bridge, another object was found. Amidst the grass and pebbles was a small yellow child's shoe, slightly smaller in size. The upper part of the shoe was clean, the sole barely smeared with mud, as if it had been thrown down rather than falling off during a run. The two items were in two different locations, but both lay in the same direction of travel, from the residential area toward the river. When the 2 points were marked on the map, the distance between them was less than 400 meters, nearly coinciding with the route the white van had taken. An officer called Rivers over, pointing to a deep depression in the soil near the roads. The tire tracks clearly showed a floral groove pattern, two parallel lines running to the edge of the grass before curving back onto the road surface. The tire tread was identified as belonging to a Ford Econoline, a popular model from the late. Paul Rivers made a quick note in his pad, his handwriting dry and cold. Vehicle stopped briefly, not parked long. Deliberate action. The forensics team began collecting soil samples and traces of fabric fibers and crushed grass. A technician pointed to a low branch, where a few small pale pink threads were caught. The fabric threads were carefully cut, sealed in a plastic bag. Rivers' gaze rested on the fabric scrap, then shifted to the mirror-like surface of the distant river. He knew that one matching DNA trace could turn the entire investigation around, but for now, everything was still fragmented pieces in a dark puzzle. News of the discovery quickly spread to the field command center. Police decided to expand the search area downstream, where the Mill River emptied into low-lying land with many abandoned warehouses. Small boats were deployed to sweep along the water's edge, while ground forces combed through every patch of grass. The entire area echoed with the sound of a low-flying helicopter, sweeping its searchlight over the murky gray river surface. When the technical team completed the sampling, the evidence bags were neatly arranged in the specialized vehicle: the purple sandal, the yellow shoe, the pink fabric fiber and mud from the scene. Everything was labeled, sealed and transferred directly to the New Haven laboratory for examination. No one spoke it aloud, but everyone understood that the two small items were likely the last things belonging to the two children. Back on the riverbank, Paul Rivers looked around the area that had just been swept. Grass was crushed, tire tracks extended, and white chalk lines circled on the ground like marked wounds. He pulled out his pen, adding a line to his notebook: indicates short vehicles, likely stopped to discard items, not to hide bodies. The words were stark but carried enough weight to silence his colleagues nearby. The somber atmosphere of the riverside made everyone feel as if time stood still. Police dogs continued sniffing for scents, but the wind changed direction constantly, and the smell of water and engine oil from the nearby warehouse masked everything. An old officer whispered that if anything had been thrown into the river, the current would have swept everything away after just a few hours of rain. As the team packed up, the police cars flashed their warning lights, the red glow reflecting on the murky gray water. All evidence had been collected, every soil trace had been marked, but all that remained was a heavy silence. Rivers looked at the mud-stained map in his hand, the two marked points lying along the same route, the path out of town toward the south, where the Mill River curved like a cup. He paused, took a deep breath and quietly said to his colleague, "He went this way," and he knew exactly where he was going. As the convoy left the area, steam still blurred the window glass. The evidence bags were carefully placed in the back, red and blue lights flashing through the fog. The river behind was silent, only the sound of the wind rustling through the low tree branches. In everyone's heart, a silent premonition grew. The path of the search had just begun, but what they were tracing was not just the children's traces, but possibly the trace of... That evening, in the small meeting room of the Milford Police Department, photographs of the Mill River crime scene were spread across the table. Under the weary yellow light, Investigator Paul Rivers stood with his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the spread-out map. Red dots marked the location of the sandal, the shoe, and the tire tracks. Everything pointed in one direction: Post Road connecting Milford to Bridgeport. If he took this route, Rivers said slowly, he could have been out of the town area and merged into the night traffic within 10 minutes. But who was he? The question silenced the entire team. No license plate, no clear face, just a silhouette of a gray-haired person, a soft voice, and an old white van. The descriptions were too vague to build a conventional suspect list. Rivers asked the data department to reopen the catalog of convicted pedophiles who had completed their sentences within the last 6 months. He knew this type of criminal tended to reoffend quickly, often choosing familiar areas. The initial list included 14 names within a 3-county radius. The team meeting lasted nearly 3 hours, with files being flipped through page by page. One name made Rivers stop: Donald James Sutter, 56 years old, convicted of child enticement in 1994, released from prison just 3 weeks ago. The file clearly stated temporary residence in Bridgeport, drives a white 1996 Ford Econoline van. His boarding house was only about 15 miles from Milford. Rivers picked up the phone to contact the Bridgeport Police Department, requesting verification. The other side replied that Sutter was considered a person who has completed his sentence and is currently under temporary parole supervision. When asked about the vehicle, the file manager said the van was registered under the Matthews Shelter Charity Organization, where Sutter had volunteered before being imprisoned. Hearing this, Rivers frowned. A vehicle bearing the name of a church, with valid papers, able to enter and exit public areas without suspicion, that was the perfect cover for a predator. He requested the technical department to scan all data on Ford Econoline vehicles registered under the St. Matthews Shelter Organization over the past 2 years. The system returned only one matching result. The license plate was replaced at the beginning of June, the time Sutter was released. He was prepared, Rivers murmured, and he didn't leave the area. Police began questioning people around the boarding house where Sutter had stayed. The landlord said he had checked out a week ago, leaving no address, only mentioning that he was going north to look for work. When Rivers asked about the van, the landlord recalled, he said he used it to carry goods for a church organization, but I never saw anyone with him. The answer left the team in silence. Meanwhile, the witnesses at Value Town were invited to headquarters for identification. The video recording was blurry, but when shown Sutter's photo from his file, both reacted almost immediately. Looks a lot like him, gray hair, that slight smile. It was not a legal confirmation, but it was enough for Rivers to understand they were on the right track. He signed the document proposing to issue a federal arrest warrant for Donald James Sutter on the charge of suspected kidnapping of 2 minors. News of the suspect was immediately transferred to neighboring police departments and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They cooperated to track Sutter's movements through his gas card system and toll booths. A cash payment receipt was found at a gas station in Stratford, about 8 miles from Milford, right after the time of the disappearance. The station's camera recorded a tall, gray-haired man in a light-colored shirt, pumping gas into a white van. The license plate was mud-covered, but the shape of the vehicle matched the description. Rivers watched the footage repeatedly, his eyes darkening. No children with him, he might have been alone at that time. The statement made the room heavy. In his old file, Sutter had been arrested for enticing children in a park in Bridgeport. The method was exactly like the night at Value Town, approaching single mothers, acting friendly, using the excuse of help to get close to the children. The victim at that time escaped because someone intervened. The charge led him to 10 years in prison, and now, after being released, he reappeared just a few miles from the old location. When the summary report was forwarded to the state level, the official arrest warrant was issued later that day. Every police station in the New Haven, Bridgeport, and Stratford areas received the description: white male, gray hair, 56 years old, driving a white Ford Econoline van, license plate belonging to St. Matthew's Shelter. Rivers sat alone in his office after the staff had left. The yellow light shone on the evidence photos spread on the table: the sandal, the yellow shoe, the pink fabric fiber. Beside them was an old picture of Donald Sutter, taken from his prison file. Emotionless eyes, tightly closed lips, a chillingly calm face. He gently tapped his pen on the table, the clicking sound steady. In his investigation journal, Rivers wrote a brief line: Donald J. Sutter is highly likely to be the main suspect. Objective: locate the van and expand the search along the Mill River Bridgeport Road. Outside the window, the sunset dyed the low rooftops red. The wind from the bay blew through, bringing damp air and the cold smell of metal. The hunt had officially begun, but an uneasy feeling still lingered in Rivers' heart. He knew well the type of person Sutter was: quiet, patient, and always one step ahead. Just one day after the arrest warrant for Donald James Sutter was issued, the case unexpectedly turned in another direction. A call came to the hotline early in the morning. A man who identified himself as a night guard at an industrial park near Post Road said he saw a dark-haired man in a gray jacket park a white van near an abandoned warehouse on the night of the disappearance. Dark hair, not gray, he emphasized, and he looked younger, about 40. That statement was enough to make the investigation team pause. All previous evidence relied on the gray-haired description, but this witness claimed the opposite, suggesting that supermarket lighting can change hair color. Paul Rivers was acutely aware that in kidnapping cases, descriptive errors could lead the investigation astray, but he couldn't ignore the new testimony. Police re-examined the list of Value Town employees who had access to the warehouse after hours. The first name that stood out: Henry Cale, 47 years old, a delivery driver who often used the supermarket's small white truck to transport goods. His personnel file showed Cale had worked there for 4 years, lived alone, with no criminal record. However, a few colleagues said he was odd, kept to himself, and often lingered around the children's toy section. This information immediately prompted a superior to request an interrogation. The same afternoon, 2 police officers arrived at Cale's residence, a rented apartment on the second floor of an old building. The door opened, and Henry Cale appeared, tall and thin, with salt and pepper dark hair and dark circles under his eyes. When he heard he was suspected in connection with the disappearance, he was stunned, shaking his head repeatedly. "I just deliver goods. I don't know anything about the children." Despite his insistence on denial, Cale was taken to headquarters for formal questioning. In the garage behind his house, police searched the white truck he used for work. Under the floor of the vehicle, they found a roll of thin nylon rope, a few old toys, and a broken-headed doll, stained with dry dirt. The sight stopped the entire team short. All evidence was sealed and immediately sent to the forensic lab. In the interrogation room, Paul Rivers watched Cale in silence for over half an hour. When he placed the evidence photos in front of him, Cale only lowered his head. "I picked those things up in the warehouse. Someone threw them away." He claimed he worked the morning shift, left the supermarket before the disappearance occurred, and knew nothing about the white van. The evidence supporting this claim was weak, but pressure from the media began to mount. Local newspapers had reported. Police questioned Value Town employees' suspicion of involvement in the disappearance of 2 girls. Meanwhile, technicians analyzed the evidence from Cale's vehicle. The results came back faster than expected. The nylon rope was the type used for packaging goods, not matching the rope sample recovered at Mill River. The soil sample on the doll was also completely different from the mud type at the location where the real evidence was found. There were no adult or child DNA traces on these items. The brief report concluded with the line, "Insufficient grounds to link to the Mill River crime scene." Rivers finished reading, feeling a sense of disappointment but not surprise. He knew this case was complicated, and everything fit too well to be a coincidence, as if some hand was leading them astray. Cale was released the next day. Before leaving headquarters, he only said one sentence: "You made the whole town believe I'm a monster." The media, as usual, did not wait for official results. The next morning, the Milford Daily Chronicle ran a large headline: "Police arrest Value Town employees suspected kidnapping of 2 girls." Numerous other news channels quoted the story, sensationalized the headlines, and debated the case. All eyes in the town focused on the man who had just been released, and inadvertently, Attention on the real suspect, Donald Sutter decreed. At the police headquarters, Rivers walked into the morning meeting room, slamming the stack of newspapers onto the table. "This is the consequence of a leak," he said, his voice low. "We just lost at least 2 days on a wrong lead." No one replied. He looked over at the bulletin board, where Sutter's old photo was still pinned. The eyes in the photo were still cold, as if they knew their every move in advance. The meeting concluded with a clear directive: focus all efforts back on the primary suspect. Teams checking gas stations, bus depots, church areas and local charities were reactivated, but the damage had been done. The false news led to a flood of calls to the hotline, mostly wrong report. One person claimed to have seen 2 girls at the New Haven bus station. Another said a dark-haired man appeared at the Bridgeport market. All were incorrect, but it took hours to verify. As night fell, Rivers sat alone in his office. The late-night television news was showing footage of Henry Cale bowing his head as he left headquarters, with a line running across the bottom: "Police release suspect, case remains unsolved." He turned off the TV, took a deep breath, and opened his notebook. Below the date, he wrote briefly, "Wrong direction, media interference, must not be repeated." Outside it began to drizzle again. On the wet road reflecting the yellow lights, the shadow of a white van sped past and disappeared into the night. Rivers did not know that while he was dismissing the wrong lead, the real suspect had already left the state, leaving behind only streaks of water and unanswered questions. In the following days, the atmosphere in the investigation team was heavy. The warrant for Donald Sutter had yet to yield results, and the rumors and press pressure were exhausting everyone. Paul Rivers rarely left the headquarters, staring intently at the map spread out on the table, where the Mill River wound like a cut through the sparsely populated residential areas. He decided to return to the starting point, where the first pieces of evidence had been found. The K-9 unit and the search team were mobilized again. They moved along the riverbank, where the ground was soft and reeds grew knee-high. The morning air was cold and damp, mist from the water covered everything with a dull gray haze. The 2 service dogs constantly sniffed, their ears erect, tongues hanging out, occasionally giving short barks when they picked up a strange scent. Paul Rivers walked behind, his eyes scanning every bush. A strange feeling gave him a hunch that they were closer than ever. Suddenly, one of the dogs stopped, tugging hard on its leash, barking continuously. The whole team rushed over. Under a low tree canopy, hidden behind a clump of ferns, was an old mud-caked metal object. When it was pulled out of the wet earth, its shape became clearly visible. A light blue stroller. One handle was broken, the wheels were caked with dirt, and the fabric lining inside was stained. The faded Valuetown logo on the aluminum frame silenced everyone. As Rivers knelt down to check, he saw a torn nylon shopping bag in the basket beneath the seat. Inside, there were still a few items of children's clothing, a crumpled receipt, and a small plastic doll with a ripped pink dress. He didn't need to ask to know that this was the item Renee Parlow had described, the one her eldest daughter always carried when going out. They looked at each other, not speaking, but everyone understood. They had found the most critical piece of the puzzle since the case began. The area was immediately cordoned off. Reflective stakes were driven into the ground in a circle around the discovery site, and caution tape was stretched between the tree trunks. The forensics team established the scene, taking photos, recording coordinates, and beginning to collect samples. Tire tracks were deeply impressed in the mud. The distance between the 2 tracks perfectly matched that of a Ford Econoline, the white van the police were looking for. A technician noted, "The tracks stop, there are no reverse marks." The vehicle stopped briefly, possibly dumped the item, and drove on. Paul Rivers stood still, listening to the steady sound of the river flowing below. A blurry scene formed in his mind, the white van stopping here on a rainy night, headlights shining through the trees, a man opening the back door, tossing something out and then leaving. He knew exactly what he was doing. The forensic team meticulously collected every detail. One officer found a different colored mud stain on the side of the stroller, a small fabric fiber stuck in the wheel axle. All were sealed. However, when the samples were quick tested at the scene, there was no viable DNA evidence. No blood, no hair, no clear fingerprint. Everything seemed to have been washed away, or exposed to the rain for too long. The discovery was immediately reported back to headquarters. At this point, officers who had worked with Renee confirmed the stroller belonged to her, used for her youngest child. There's no mistaking it, one said. The blue color and the silver paint streak on the handle, exactly right. Rivers ordered that photos of the evidence be sent to Renee for identification. Upon seeing the doll, she only managed to whisper, "Charisse." She always kept that doll in her hand. The remark brought silence to the room. Paul Rivers turned to the window, a chill running down his spine. He understood that the case had gone beyond the scope of a typical missing persons report. If these items were deliberately abandoned, it meant the kidnapper had calculated every step, perhaps even intending to mislead the investigation. That afternoon, the preliminary report was completed. Evidence: blue stroller, belonging to the Parlow family. Contents: shopping bag, Valuetown receipt, plastic doll. Related traces: Ford Econoline tire tracks. If forensic results: no human DNA or biological samples detected. The report was brief, but the conclusion weighed heavily on everyone. The probability of serious criminal conduct is high. Case classification is upgraded: double abduction, foul play suspected. As the team packed up, the sky turned a solid gray. Fog from the river rose, obscuring the treetops. Paul Rivers stood silently, looking down at the dark water, an inexpressible sense of unease welling up inside him. He knew he was getting closer to the truth, but at the same time sinking deeper into a nightmare. Somewhere along the silent Mill River, there might still be other traces waiting to be found, and each new discovery only made the silence of that night more terrifying. 3 months passed since the blue stroller was found on the banks of Mill River. All the Milford police had gathered were a few lifeless pieces of evidence: a broken-headed doll, a crumpled receipt, and some tire tracks almost erased by the rain. No biological traces, no new witnesses, no useful calls from the hotline. Paul Rivers' sleepless nights and his team's efforts yielded only empty reports, no significant result. Donald James Sutter, the gray-haired man, the prime suspect, seemed to have vanished from the map. The federal warrant remained active, but he was not seen in any state. Sutter's probation file indicated he had registered temporary residency in Bridgeport, but the apartment had been vacant for weeks before the police arrived. The landlord said he had only left a few old items and checked out quietly. The Ford Econoline van, the only thing that could be tracked, was also no longer in the vehicle registration system. The license plate registered to St. Matthew's Shelter was reported lost, but the organization confirmed they had no contact with anyone named Sutter since early June. Unable to trace the suspect's path, Rivers accessed traffic camera data along Interstate I-95, hoping to spot the white van through the automatic toll system. All efforts were futile. Cameras were blurry, the archived images lacked sufficient resolution, and many segments had been deleted due to overwriting. Every opened lead only led to a dead end. Pressure from the media and the community increased daily. They called, sent anonymous letters, demanding answers. The press covered the story as a tragedy. The 2 Milford girls, the last sight, vanished in the supermarket lights. Local residents placed flowers and candles near the riverbank where the stroller was found. But gradually, as there was no new news, the public interest cooled. The candles died out, leaving streaks of melted wax on the concrete. Rivers continued to cling to the case, even though there was almost nothing left to explore in the file. He and his colleagues drove all over the river area, checking abandoned warehouses, forests and landfills, places where bodies might be hidden. But there were no signs. Once, a service dog detected a strange odor at an old industrial site, but digging only uncovered a decomposed bag of trash. The fragile hopes were constantly dashed, severely lowering the team's morale. In the office, the case board was covered with photos and timeline diagrams. Red threads connected the Valuetown supermarket to Mill River, spreading out from there in countless directions, only to end with a large question mark. On his desk, Paul Rivers kept the photo of the 2 girls Renee Parlow had given him in the early days of the investigation. In the picture, Charisse smiled radiantly, holding the pink doll, while Destiny nestled beside her sister, her eyes wide. Every time he looked, he felt a knot in his stomach. In early October, a summary meeting was held at the Milford Police Department headquarters. Representatives from the FBI and the Connecticut Department of Justice attended. The conclusion was unavoidable. No progress, no new evidence, suspect not located. According to procedure, the case was recommended for transfer to the New Haven County Cold Case Unit for archiving and periodic review. When the minutes were read, the room fell silent. Paul Rivers said nothing. He simply signed at the bottom of the page, the handwriting slightly shaky from exhaustion. From now on his case was no longer in his hands. A young officer collected the folders, labeling them, "Unsolved case, temporarily closed." That evening, a light rain fell in Milford. Paul Rivers drove alone along Mill River, a road he had traveled countless times. The river water glimmered with streetlights, the flow slow, as if hiding its own secret. He stopped his car by the bridge, standing still and looking down at the dark water. For a moment he saw the image of the blue stroller abandoned in the damp woods, saw the figures of the two children holding hands and walking toward the brightly lit supermarket aisle. The scene repeated in his mind, like a VHS tape playing on and on without an end. Upon returning to headquarters, on his desk was a new case file cover, bearing the cold inscription, "Case, number 2 on Milford 34A. AB status inactive, transferred to cold case unit." Rivers stared at the inscription for a long time, then closed the file. He knew that when a case was temporarily closed, the chance of finding the victims was almost zero. Outside, the town hall clock chimed 12, signaling a new day. In the dark room, the sound of a pen tapping rhythmically on the desk. Paul Rivers wrote the final line in his work log before turning off the light. "No bodies found. Suspect not located. Case temporarily closed. But I cannot stop here." Then he closed the notebook, left the office, leaving behind the faint yellow light reflecting on the caseboard, where two small faces still smiled in the old photo, as if still waiting for someone to return and find. Time passed as silently as the Mill River itself, where the last traces of the two Parlow children were once held. After the case was temporarily closed, the file 2001 Mill 34 AB was stored in the cold storage of the New Haven County Cold Case Unit. The file was nearly 4 inches thick, the paper cover yellowed, containing blurry photocopies, investigation transcripts, crime scene photos, and hundreds of old newspaper clippings. Each year, new people would read it, write a few lines of notes, and put it away again. From 2001 to 2024, the file was reviewed a total of 4 times. Each time the conclusion was the same. Insufficient new evidence. No information to locate the suspect. The DNA sample collected from the beige rope at Mill River degraded after many years, leaving only a few fragmented gene sequences. The technology at the time was not powerful enough to extract information. Police held on to the hope that one day, with more advanced techniques, the sample could speak. But as years passed, those involved in the case retired, transferred or passed away. Paul Rivers also left the force in 2014, carrying an unending sense of regret. Over the 2 decades, the names Charisse and Destiny Parlow gradually faded from the memory of most Milford residents. Only a few commemorative articles remained in the local newspaper, a few dried flowers on the riverbank every July, the day the 2 children went missing. The mother, Renee, moved out of town, leaving no forwarding address. The case lay dormant, seemingly buried with time. Then the world changed. Forensic technology entered a new era. Starting around 2020, the Connecticut State Laboratory began implementing forensic genealogy, a method of genetic tracing by comparing DNA with civil genealogy databases. A series of seemingly hopeless cold cases were reopened, and many criminals who had evaded capture for decades were found. In the list of hundreds of files awaiting re-examination, the code 2001 Mill 34 AB was on line 17. In 2024, Detective Laura Kim, a new generation investigator for the Cold Case Unit, was assigned the case. She was in her early 30s, came from the forensics department, and was known for her meticulousness and patience. On a fall morning, upon receiving the thick, dust-covered file, Laura asked her superior only one question. "Is this the case of the 2 sisters who went missing at Mill River?" Receiving a nod, she opened the file right at her desk and did not close it for months afterward. Laura spent nearly 2 weeks just reading the entire old report, every handwritten line by Paul Rivers, every blurry image of the blue stroller. She noticed what many before her had overlooked. The DNA sample on the beige rope, though degraded, still retained a segment of viable gene sequence, if processed with new generation sequencing technology. Combined with statewide expanded genealogy data, the chance of identification could reach 9. She directly contacted the New Haven laboratory, requesting access to the sample sealed for over 20 years. When the storage clerk opened the cabinet, the yellowed seal tape peeled slightly. Inside was a small test tube containing a few dark brown beige fibers numbered 20. Laura carefully signed for it and transferred the sample to the analysis lab. In her work log she wrote briefly, "Parlow case, reopened for DNA analysis using NGS technology. Objective, identify suspect or person of interest." That evening as she left headquarters, she paused in the hallway, looking at the board displaying photos of unsolved cold cases. Among dozens of faces, the picture of the two Parlow children stood out because of their innocent smiles and hopeful eyes. Laura gently touched the photo, murmuring as if to herself, 23 years, we won't let you stay silent this time. Outside the window, the autumn wind carried a chill from Long Island Sound, sweeping along the old streets. In the small room where the green light of the DNA sequencer blinked, the old evidence fibers from 2001, the machine hummed steadily, slowly, like the beat of a heart waking up after a long sleep. No one on the team knew that in just a few months, the results from those DNA fibers would pull the entire case from darkness back into the light, and once again the name Donald James Sutter would appear in the report. After 24 years of silence, the spring storm of 2025 that swept through southern Connecticut brought heavy rain and fierce, gusting winds. For 3 days the water level of the Mill River rose, carrying mud and tree roots, causing a partial collapse of the eastern bank, the very spot marked as the scene of a disappearance 24 years early. When the water receded, the area was left with long cracks and large patches of earth that had slid into the riverbed. It was there that fate once again brought the Parlow case back to light. A team of environmental workers was sent to clean up the riverbank area after the storm. While collecting driftwood, one of them noticed something unusual amidst the mud, a small ivory-white bone, partially exposed from the brown clay. Initially they thought it was an animal bone, but as they excavated more, the shape of a small forearm bone became clear, wrapped with a fragment of pale pink fabric. The worker fell silent for a few seconds, then immediately called the police. The New Haven County Cold Case Unit received the report within 10 minutes. Detective Laura Kim, the lead on the Parlow case, was the first to arrive at the scene. When she saw the collapsed section of the bank, her professional instinct told her, this was no coincidence. The entire area was immediately cordoned off, and forensic teams, technicians and canine units were dispatched. Beneath the remaining layer of mud, they found more small bone fragments, showing signs of long-term decomposition, along with pieces of darkened pink fabric. A small beige length of rope, tightly embedded in the soil, was also recovered. When forensic specialists separated it, the fibers inside still retained their structure, identical to the type of rope seized in the 2001 case. Laura stood silently, her eyes following the murky, swirling river below. 24 years ago, this very river had swallowed every trace, and now, it was returning the pieces of the truth. All samples were urgently transferred to the Connecticut State Forensic Laboratory. The examination process lasted more than a week, with thorough step-by-step analysis using the new generation DNA technology that Laura had proposed. When the results were delivered to her desk, the first line made her heart pound. DNA comparison results between bone sample and Parlow case file data, 2001 Milford 34AB. Absolute match, 99.98%. Identity Charisse Parlow, female, 8 years old. The air in the room was nearly solid. Laura folded the results and closed her eyes for a few seconds. 24 years, and a name had finally been found. But the comfort was accompanied by a chilling sadness. Charisse was no longer a missing child, she was a victim. When the forensic team expanded the excavation area, they found additional small pieces of evidence around the location of the remains, plastic fragments from a toy, a ballpoint pen tip, and notably the beige rope segment buried in the old soil layer. Under the microscope, the internal fibers showed a synthetic structure, identical to the sealed rope sample from the 2001 crime scene. Both samples were sent for trace DNA analysis and comparison. The results were a complete match. The DNA recovered from the surface of the beige rope belonged to Donald James Sutter. Laura Kim could not hide her shock as she read the report. Donald Sutter, the man wanted 2 decades ago, had been arrested in Florida in 2012 for impersonating a social worker and was currently serving a 15-year sentence at Marion Correctional Institution. He was noted in the original file as having potential for repeat offenses involving children. Now evidence from Connecticut directly linked him to the case. That same night, the cold case unit urgently requested the FBI Jacksonville, Florida field office to verify inmate Sutter's DNA sample against the new evidence. 3 days later, the official confirmation was returned, match confirmed, 100% DNA correlation. The small cold case unit conference room was quiet as Laura read the results aloud. A long moment passed with no one speaking. Then an older officer quietly exhaled. So finally we have the truth. On May 18, 2025, the Connecticut State Police announced the decision to reopen the Parlow sisters case, marking the return of one of the nation's longest-running cold cases. Local media quickly covered the news, with the headline the next morning reading, "Cold Case 2001, Remains of Missing Girl, Found After 24 Years." A weak ray of sunlight shone on the old photos on the case board. 2 little girls with innocent smiles, the blue stroller, the foggy river. She spoke softly, almost a whisper. "Charisse, we found you." But she knew in her heart, this journey was not over, because one more person, Destiny, was still missing, and the final answer still lay somewhere along the Mill River bank. After Charisse Parlow's identity was confirmed, the 24-year-old cold case investigation entered its most urgent phase. While the public was still reeling from the news, the New Haven County Cold Case Unit was practically sleepless. Detective Laura Kim understood that finding Charisse was only half the truth. The other girl, Destiny, had yet to be brought home. The investigative team began to expand the search area along the flow of the Mill River, based on the hypothesis that if the 2 sisters were murdered at the same time, the perpetrator might have moved Destiny's body downstream to disperse the evidence. The state's hydrology department assisted in simulating the water flow from 2001, a time of prolonged heavy rain. The model suggested that mud and remains could have drifted into the tributary Pequannock Creek, where the current was weaker and natural debris often accumulated. Small boats were mobilized, with K-9 units and divers coordinating the search over a nearly 5-mile stretch of the river. The work was slow and exhausting. The river water was murky, and the banks were dense with reeds and tangled roots. At the bottom, thick mud and scrap metal caused the metal detectors to constantly give false readings. Despite this, Laura persistently showed up every day, standing on the bank, documenting every area that had been swept. If Charisse was there, she often told the team, Destiny can't be fought. 3 weeks later, the effort was rewarded. On a gloomy afternoon, as divers swept near an old wooden bridge, spanning a bend in Pequannock Creek, they discovered an object caught under a large tree root. At first, they thought it was a trapped trash bag, but when the water was drained, the shape of a small body gradually emerged. Black electrical wire was wrapped around the wrists and ankles, the clothes were torn, and hair was mixed with the mud. No one spoke a word as the scene unfolded before them. The scene was immediately sealed off. Police, forensics and Laura's entire investigative team were present. The mud was carefully cleared from around the body, layer by layer, to avoid losing any trace. A small mud-caked plastic bag was found nearby, containing several rusted toys, etched with the letter D. The initial that the girl's mother had mentioned stood for Destiny. No one needed further confirmation. When the body was brought up, Laura stood silently on the bank. Her tears did not fall, but her hands were clenched white. After 24 years, Destiny had been found, but not in the way anyone had wished. The forensic examination results were returned within a week. The report began with the line, victim, female, estimated 5 to 6 years old, time of death estimated concurrent with Charisse Parlow, approximately July 2001. Traces of binding with black electrical wire, a different type from the beige rope used with the first victim. The last sentence in the report silenced the entire team. Human DNA sample on the surface of the electrical wire does not match Donald James Sutter. This meant that the person who bound Destiny was not Sutter, or at the very least, he did not act alone. Laura Kim reread the report 3 times. The narrative she thought was closed suddenly opened in a new direction, colder and more complex. She reopened the old file, flipping to the 2001 section. It included a passage about Henry Cale, a delivery driver who was once wrongly suspected and then released. Cale worked at Valuetown, had access to the warehouse, and was described by a witness as having dark hair driving a white vehicle. At the time, police found no evidence to charge him, but what if Cale knew Sutter? What if the two had met? That question kept Laura glued to the caseboard for hours. She pinned Henry Cale's photo next to Sutter's, connecting the two names with a red thread. Now, everything made sense. Sutter was the lure. Cale helped dispose of the bodies, each playing a role. The black electrical wire on Destiny's body was the first piece of evidence of a second accomplice. News of the second body's discovery spread rapidly through the media. Newspapers headlined, "24 years after disappearance, younger sister's remains found, possibility of more than one perpetrator." Television news reports reran old footage from 2001, interspersed with images of Laura Kim working at the new scene. The Milford community was stunned, and the Parlow family, now only the mother living quietly in another state, was notified privately through police representatives. As night fell, Laura stood alone at the Paquonic Bridge, watching the yellow lights reflect on the dark, still water. At the bottom, the river had kept its secret for 2 decades, and now it had revealed the second part of the story. But instead of an end, everything was starting over, with a new question, heavier than all the others. Who was the second person alongside Donald Sutter? The New Haven lab worked through the night. The black electrical wire wrapped around Destiny's body was cut into segments, scanned under an electron microscope, and processed with a new generation DNA extraction protocol. After 24 years buried in the mud, no one thought there would be a strong enough genetic sample left for analysis. But on Tuesday morning, the unexpected results were delivered to Detective Laura Kim's desk. The first line made her jump to her feet. Electrical wire DNA result, 100% match with the profile of Henry Cale, male, 47 years old at the time of 2000. Cale, the man once wrongly suspected, besieged by the media, then released due to insufficient evidence. 24 years ago, everything was just suspicion. Now, science had the final word. The DNA trace remaining on the electrical wire that bound Destiny was his. Laura reopened Cale's old file. Every detail seemed clearer in the light of the present. A Valuetown delivery driver, with after-hours access to the warehouse, working during the same period Sutter frequented the area. In his 2001 statement, Cale had said he never met Sutter, but when Laura rechecked the Valuetown landline phone records, she found an overlapping contact, a 6-minute call from Cale's line to a number registered under St. Matthew's Shelter, the address Sutter used. Date of call June 10, 2001, just 10 days before the disappearance. This coincidence was too precise to be random. She immediately requested the technical department to expand the trace, reviewing old transaction records, GPS data and witness statements. One of the Valuetown employees at the time confirmed that Henry Cale once talked to a strange man with gray hair at the back delivery counter. When asked further, the person recalled, "I thought he was someone from a charity, he was with a white van." The sequence of facts gradually pieced together a coherent picture. Sutter and Cale knew each other before the case. Perhaps they met through a charity program, or in the delivery area, and planned together. Sutter was the one who approached and lured. Cale, with his access to the supermarket's rear area, provided the means and a convenient location to leave the area without suspicion. Laura presented this finding at an emergency meeting of the cold case unit. The room was silent as she projected the link diagram between the two men onto the screen. Donald Sutter, history of pedophilia, owned a white Ford Econoline van, currently serving time in Florida. Henry Cale, Valuetown delivery driver, once wrongly arrested, now DNA matches evidence binding Destiny. Between the two names, the single connection was the phone call on 6/10, but that much plus the DNA was enough to change the entire case. When she finished her presentation, the chief of investigation said slowly, "It took us 24 years to move from suspicion to evidence, and this time, there will be no mistake." The FBI was invited to assist in the reconstruction phase. A 3D model was built. Sutter lured the Parlow mother and daughters at Valuetown. Cale waited at the back delivery area, assisting in taking the two girls out of the supermarket through the service door, into the white van, with the charity organization's license plate. From there, the journey led straight to the Mill River, where Charisse was murdered. After that, Cale or both of them moved Destiny's body down to Pequannock Creek for disposal. Although the exact sequence could not be confirmed, the physical evidence was strong enough to close the loop on the theory. Sutter was the lure. Cale was involved in the binding and disposal. A separate investigative group was established to prepare the indictment file. 2 parallel files were created, one for Donald James Sutter, currently incarcerated in Florida, one for Henry Cale, now 71, living in a small town near Hartford. Federal arrest warrants were drafted that same week. That evening, Laura Kim sat alone in her office, looking up at the photo board, where the 2 old men's faces lay next to the picture of the 2 Parlow children. The light reflected on the red thread connecting the photos, like a wound closing belatedly after 24 years. She wrote in her end-of-day report, DNA results confirm Henry Cale's direct involvement with Destiny Parlow. The link between Cale and Sutter is established through phone data and witness testimony. Conclusion: Sutter, the perpetrator; Cale, the accomplice, involved in binding and disposal. Indictment files for both suspects have been prepared and forwarded to the Connecticut State Prosecutor. The door to the case that had closed in 2001 finally burst open, and this time its echo resonated down the halls of the cold case unit, as a promise that justice, though delayed, would find its way. In June 2025, the Parlow case entered its final stage. After 24 years of hiding in the shadows, 2 names, Donald James Sutter and Henry Cale, were officially recorded on a federal arrest warrant. The Federal Bureau of Investigation (FBI), in coordination with the Connecticut Cold Case Unit, launched a simultaneous capture operation in 2 states to prevent either suspect from escaping or warning the other. In Florida, Sutter was serving his sentence at Marion Correctional Institution, a medium-security prison located deep in the swamps. The FBI issued an urgent subpoena to transfer him to the Investigative Isolation Unit, following a special protocol for suspects linked to federal homicide cases. When the 2 agents entered the room, Sutter lifted his head, a faint smile appearing at the corner of his mouth. He had aged considerably, his hair white, his skin wrinkled, but his eyes still held something cold and empty, as if he had anticipated the reason for their visit. "Mr. Sutter, we have new DNA results from the 2001 Connecticut case," one agent said. He only responded with a dry, hollow laugh. 24 years, and you still haven't given up." When informed of the indictment for first-degree murder and kidnapping a minor, Sutter showed no reaction. He remained silent, only nodding when signing the document acknowledging his rights. At the same time, in Connecticut, an FBI task force and state police surrounded a small house on the edge of the woods in Hartford County, where Henry Cale lived. The wooden door opened slowly. The man, now over 70 with sparse white hair, stepped out with a limp. He didn't ask why, didn't resist, only whispered, "I guess it's finally my turn." As the handcuffs were snapped on, Cale glanced briefly at the trees behind the house, where he had silently been in hiding for 2 decades. Both were temporarily detained in 2 different states, while the investigative team prepared for the interrogation phase. All cameras, microphones, and recordings were activated, but for the first several hours, both Sutter and Cale maintained absolute silence. When an agent read the indictment aloud, detailing the DNA evidence, witness testimony, and simulation of the journey on the night of June 20, Sutter leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, saying nothing except for a single sentence. "You're chasing ghosts." Laura Kim flew to Florida to directly supervise Sutter's interrogation. She didn't speak much, simply placing a photograph of the 2 Parlow sisters on the table, a picture taken at a summer park in 2000. Sutter opened his eyes, looked at the photo for a long time, and then turned away. "I didn't do it," he said, his voice almost a whisper. But Laura saw something else in his eyes, a mixed feeling of deceit and self-satisfaction. Unable to extract a direct confession, the FBI moved to Plan B, using a prison informant. An agent was planted in the same detention block as Sutter, posing as an inmate convicted of an economic crime. His sole mission to prompt conversation and record any statement that might hint at the case. For over 3 weeks, the agent sat listening to Sutter tell vague stories about nights up north, about a friend who helped clean up mess. One evening, while speaking about disobedient children, he uttered a sentence that made everyone hold their breath. "I didn't kill them, I just took them out of the supermarket." Henry was the one who finished things. The conversation was fully recorded. In the tape, Sutter didn't explicitly say Parlow, but every detail matched the case file, the location, the vehicle, and even the beige rope. That statement, though indirect, was enough to prove his presence at the scene and his primary role in the kidnapping. When the transcript was sent to the cold case unit, the audio technology team authenticated the voice print, cross-referencing it with an old sample from the 2001 file. Result: 100% match. The tape was quickly legalized as circumstantial evidence in the federal indictment. Meanwhile, Cale in Connecticut finally spoke up. During the fifth interrogation session, he admitted to helping Sutter transport cargo, but denied knowing there were children in the vehicle. However, when faced with irrefutable DNA evidence, Cale only lowered his head in silence. "I didn't think he would kill them," he murmured. On June 30, 2025, the two suspects were officially charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and unlawful sexual conduct with a minor. The cold case unit and the FBI signed off, confirming the file contained sufficient grounds for prosecution. When Laura Kim left the briefing room that day, heavy rain was falling outside in Florida. She paused under the eaves, watching the water wash away streaks of dust on the ground. In that moment, she knew the case had reached its conclusion, but also the beginning of a new chapter, where justice would finally have its voice, albeit 24 years late. After Sutter and Cale were arrested, the entire case file was transferred to the Connecticut State Forensics Lab for comprehensive examination, the final step before submitting the indictment to the court. Over 24 years had passed, hundreds of old exhibits were unsealed, and the new results from modern technology allowed the reconstruction of the entire sequence of events on that fateful night in 2001, accurate to the hour, to the smallest detail. The forensic report, over 100 pages thick, was presented to the cold case unit at the end of July. On the very first page, a chilling line in bold read, "Comprehensive conclusion. Both victims died the same night, June 20. Forensic examiners determined that Charisse was murdered first, near the Mill River area, where the blue stroller and beige rope were found. Analysis of the soil and pollen in the remnants on Charisse's clothing exactly matched the soil layer of the North Bank section of the river. Pollen from the species Solidago canadensis, Canada goldenrod, which only grows in that area, was found on her hair and collar. The sample of beige rope still carried Donald Sutter's DNA, matching the Florida inmate profile. Approximately 40 minutes later, based on biological clock and differing decomposition rates between the two bodies, Destiny was murdered at the Pequannock Creek area, about 3 miles from Mill River. The black electrical cord wrapped around the body carried Henry Cale's DNA, along with traces of specific soil containing pollen from the species Acer rubrum, red maple found only near the creek. All factors indicated that the two children were killed at two different locations, within a very short time frame, and by two different men who were in close coordination. The crime scene simulation, constructed with three-dimensional technology, allowed the recreation of the two suspects' movements. From the Valuetown camera footage, the forensic team determined that Sutter and the two girls left the supermarket based on the distance and average travel speed, he could have reached Mill River within 10 minutes. Specialists analyzed the Ford Econoline's vehicle location data, which matched the direction of tire tracks at the scene. Conclusion: Charisse was assaulted and murdered on the riverbank, her body temporarily concealed under the mud near the water. Subsequently, Sutter called or met Cale, who was near the Valuetown delivery area, to help dispose of the second victim. A particularly noteworthy detail for the experts was the organization and control of the criminal act. The ligature marks on the two victims were tied with two completely different types of knots. One was a common sailor's knot, used in manual labor, consistent with Sutter's past as a boat repairman. The other was a technical electrical knot, matching Cale's profession as a delivery and equipment repairman. These two knots indicated that each man performed a separate act, using his own skill set, but both followed a prearranged plan. The forensics lab also analyzed the correlation between the time of death and the white van's journey, based on old VHS tapes and 2001 toll data. A gas station camera in Stratford recorded a white van around 11:15 p.m. 30 minutes after Charisse's estimated time of death. This was also the time Cale was believed to have left Valuetown. Traces of dirt on the floor mat of the vehicle, recovered from the old sealed evidence, matched two types of soil, the sandy loam soil of Mill River and the red clay mud of Pequannock Creek. The two areas were exactly 3 miles apart, both lying along the route the van had traveled. Laura Kim read each page of the report, a cold feeling running down her spine. After 24 years, every final piece of the puzzle fit. Charisse and Destiny were murdered on the same night, by two men who knew each other, coordinated their actions, and had planned meticulously beforehand. There was no room left for coincidence, no room for ambiguity. The report concluded, Donald James Sutter, age 56 at the time of the crime, performed the act of luring, kidnapping and murdering victim Charisse Parlow at Mill River. Henry Cale, age 47 at the time of the crime, directly participated in the confinement, murder and disposal of Destiny Parlow at Pequannock Creek. The criminal acts involved communication and coordination and were premeditated. As Laura set the report down on the table, the late afternoon light streamed through the window, illuminating the two black and white photos of the Parlow girls pinned above the caseboard. Their bright, innocent eyes seemed to look back at the woman who had persistently refused to give up. She spoke softly, her voice catching, "Now we know what happened." And in that moment, the silence of 24 years was finally broken by the cold language of science, yet carrying the profound weight of justice. In December 2025, at the New Haven Federal Courthouse, courtroom number 4 had special security in place. Dozens of reporters, cameras, and citizens lined up from early morning to attend the trial they dubbed the final cold case of the 20. The two defendants, Donald James Sutter, 80, and Henry Cale, 71, were brought in wearing orange prison jumpsuits, hands cuffed, their eyes quiet like two ghosts of the past, just dragged out of the darkness. Judge Eleanor Rhodes, presiding over the trial, opened the proceedings with a deep, resolute voice. After 24 years, justice can still arrive, however delayed. This trial is not only to judge two men, but also to close a dark chapter in the history of the state of Connecticut. The prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Daniel Whitmore, presented an indictment covering 4 main charges: intentional kidnapping, first-degree murder, unlawful sexual assault of a minor, and tampering with evidence. He began with the grainy images from the Value Town camera, the last sight of Charisse and Destiny alive. The large screen in the courtroom showed Sutter walking under the cold white fluorescent lights, the two children holding hands, following him. When the video stopped, the entire room fell into suffocating silence. Next, the prosecutor successively presented the chain of evidence reconstructed throughout the reinvestigation. Sutter's DNA on the beige rope that bound Charisse, Cale's DNA on the black electrical cord that bound Destiny. Soil samples, pollen, and knot structures matching the two crime scenes at Mill River and Pequannock Creek. The secret recording obtained by the prison informant, in which Sutter indirectly admitted to taking the kids out of the supermarket and Henry finishing things. The testimony of Renee Parlow, the mother, recounting the final moments she saw her two daughters walking away with the gray-haired man. As the evidence was sequentially displayed, the defense attorneys attempted to argue that the physical evidence was no longer intact after 20 years, and that indirect recordings cannot prove intent to murder. However, the prosecutor rebutted each point with modern forensic evidence. The DNA was fully restored, with an error margin of only 1. For 3 consecutive days, more than 10 witnesses were summoned, from forensic specialists to former investigator Paul Rivers, who first investigated the case, and he stepped onto the stand, his hair gray, his deep voice trembling but firm. "We couldn't find the girls that day, but now science has achieved what my heart always hoped for, bringing the truth back." Then came the testimony of Detective Laura Kim, the woman who reopened the file after 2 decades. She stood straight before the court, recounting every step of the investigation, every piece of evidence unearthed, every night spent alone with the old photograph. When the image of the 2 bodies found in 2025 was projected, many in the room shed tears. When it was the defendant's turn, Sutter maintained his cold demeanor, only looking down. Cale sat with his head bowed, his hands shaking. When asked if he wished to offer a defense, Sutter replied quietly, "I have nothing more to say. Everyone believes what they want to believe." The trial lasted for 11 days. The jury of 12 was tasked with reviewing over 400 pieces of evidence, 36 testimonies, and 2 independent forensic reports. They took just over 4 hours to reach a conclusion. On the afternoon of December 20, as the clerk read the verdict, The entire room held its breath. The jury is unanimous, 12 out of 12 votes, declaring defendant Donald James Sutter guilty of first-degree murder and intentional kidnapping. Defendant Henry Cale is guilty of accomplice to first-degree murder and concealment of a victim's body. A murmur spread through the room. Renee Parlow, the mother who had remained silent throughout the trial, buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Laura Kim stood behind her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Neither spoke, only looking toward the bench where the two men sat motionless, their faces seemingly devoid of emotion. Judge Rhodes delivered the sentence. Donald James Sutter, you are sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Henry Cale, you are sentenced to life imprisonment without parole for your role as an accomplice. You took the lives of two innocent children and caused an entire community to live in fear for. No penalty is sufficient to measure this, only justice, however late, to prove that what you tried to bury will ultimately be exposed. The gavel slammed down. The sound echoed in the courtroom, closing a chapter of history. The press immediately ran the bold headline, "Cold Case Solved After 24 Years, Justice for the Parlow Sisters." Leaving the court, Laura Kim walked slowly through the long corridor bathed in the afternoon light. Outside, the Milford sky was blue, and the wind from the Mill River carried a faint scent of salt. She paused before the steps, took a deep breath, and whispered as if to herself, 24 years, but in the end, justice arrived. Somewhere between the sound of the wind and the sunlight, there seemed to be a faint, clear echo of children's laughter, like the response of two small souls finally finding peace. 3 months after the historic trial, the New Haven County Cold Case Unit officially released the Parlow Sisters Investigation Summary Report, an 86-page document re-evaluating the entire investigation process from two. The report is considered a detailed legal autopsy, not only recounting the journey of solving the case, but also dissecting the errors that delayed justice for 2 decades. At the press conference held at the Connecticut State Police headquarters, Detective Laura Kim stood beside the Cold Case Unit chief and an FBI representative. She did not give a long speech, only a brief statement. It took us 24 years to bring the truth to light. The important thing now is to ensure no other child is lost in the shadow of similar mistakes. The report is divided into 2 major sections, the failures of 2001. The first section candidly acknowledges a series of systemic errors during the initial investigation phase. The report states, the Parlow case is a prime example of the severe impact of a lack of federal coordination and outdated technology in the early 20s. 3 major errors are highlighted. Delayed Amber Alert issuance. On the night of June 21, in that time, Donald Sutter's white van had left Milford and merged into traffic on I-95. The report asserts, had the alert system been functioning on time, the probability of intercepting the vehicle at the Stratford toll plaza was very high. Mistaken witness identification. A witness at the scene described a man with dark hair, leading police to mistakenly arrest Henry Cale, a delivery driver. This error not only wasted 3 days of investigation, but also gave Sutter enough time to flee the state. The report notes, witness training in 2001 was rudimentary, lacking guidance on memory distortion under artificial lighting. Substandard DNA storage. The initial DNA samples, specifically the beige rope fibers, were preserved in ordinary glass tubes, without a refrigeration system or metadata logging. A portion of the sample degraded, making 2 decades of testing incomplete until the advent of next-generation sequencing technology. The report concludes, this was the direct cause of the case being temporarily closed and prolonged for over 20 years. Progress of 2025. The second part of the report is a complete contrast. It showcases the significant advancement of forensic science and federal cooperation procedure. Forensic genealogy. A trace in the bloodline. By applying the statewide genetic genealogy database, the investigation team traced matching gene segments in a Florida inmate's record, thereby re-identifying Donald Sutter. This method is evaluated as the breakthrough that transformed a seemingly impossible case into a prosecutable one. Next-generation sequencing, NGS DNA technology. The New Haven laboratory utilized the next-generation sequencing system, which allowed for the recovery of heavily degraded DNA and the analysis of trace evidence. As a result, the forensic team determined that both victims died on the same night, with a 40-minute time interval, and successfully separated the DNA of 2 perpetrators from 2 different types of restraints. Something impossible with old technology. Federal cooperation. The shared intelligence model. The Parlow case was the first time 3 levels of agencies, local police, the cold case unit and the FBI, shared data online in real time through the new federal platform launched in. This helped trace the connection between Cale and Sutter in just 48 hours, instead of months as before. Witness management and media procedures. The report proposes mandatory training for local police on witness identification under artificial light conditions, as well as regulations to control the leakage of information to the media. A costly lesson learned from the 2001 error when the press incorrectly published the suspect's identity. Even Paul Rivers, the case's first investigator, now retired, was invited back as a consultant for the cold case training program in New Haven. He often told young trainees, "I failed once, but the Parlow case taught me that justice never dies. It just needs someone patient enough to dig it out of the mud of time." Outside the cold case unit headquarters, a small memorial plaque was erected by the Mill River, where it all began. Inscribed on it in bright steel letters, "In memory of Therese and Destiny Parlow, cold case solved after 24 years. Their story continues to teach us how to find the truth." Those words became a symbol for the American cold case investigation field. A reminder that no matter how much time passes, there will always be those willing to go back, follow every smallest trace to bring justice home. In the fall of 2025, the air in Milford carried the typical chill of a coastal town. By the Mill River, once a silent crime scene for 2 decades, hundreds of residents gathered to attend the memorial service for Therese and Destiny Parlow. White ribbons were tied along the wooden bridge, and yellow chrysanthemums were released to float down the stream. The choirs singing from the small nearby church echoed softly, like a gentle farewell to 2 young souls to a place of peace. On the podium, the mayor of Milford's voice choked as he recalled the town's long journey. "For 24 years, we lived with an unanswered question. Today, the answer has come, though late, but justice has finally found its way back." In the front row, Renee Parlow, the mother, now older with gray hair and a thinner frame, tightly held Detective Laura Kim's hand. Without words, they both looked down at the river. The water glistened in the evening light, rolling the flower petals, as if washing away some of the painful memories. Renee whispered, "I'm not afraid of the dreams anymore. My children have been found." Newspapers nationwide simultaneously published images of the ceremony with large headlines, "Justice after 24 years of silence." Editorials praised the Parlow case as a symbol of persistence and innovation in American investigation. Journalists wrote that sometimes justice doesn't arrive with loud sirens or noisy verdicts, but in a quiet afternoon by the river, where people can finally say goodbye. But the case's aftermath was more than just emotion. It created tangible changes in the Milford community. The Connecticut state government enacted the Safe Alert Connecticut program, improving the missing child alert system, ensuring signals are automatically transmitted via mobile phones and electronic traffic signs within the first 5 minutes of receiving a report. Local police also established a mechanism to monitor repeat sex offenders using GPS tracking, preventing individuals like Donald Sutter from having another chance to hide. Schools in the area organized guidance sessions for parents on child safety. The photo of the 2 Parlow sisters became an emblem in community campaigns, not to recall the tragedy but to teach vigilance and compassion. As for the Parlow family, they established the Therese and Destiny Foundation, a non-profit fund to support families with missing children and to sponsor forensic projects in Connecticut. The foundation was co-founded by Renee and a group of retired investigators, with the motto, "To bring every missing child home." In the first year alone, the fund helped finance DNA testing costs for 8 other cold cases in the New England region. That evening, after the memorial, Laura Kim lingered by the river. On the water, the flower petals still gently floated, reflecting the yellow light from the bridge. She recalled Paul Rivers' words from their last meeting, "Justice never dies, it just sleeps very deep." Now she understood its meaning more clearly than ever. The story of Therese and Destiny Parlow has concluded, but its echoes still resonate, in classrooms, laboratories, and in the hearts of those who believe that time can blur everything, except justice. On the small memorial plaque by the river, inscribed in bright steel letters, "Justice came late, but it came. The Parlow sisters' case is not just a story of a crime concealed for 2 decades, but also a reflection of the real challenges facing American society today, where technology, justice, and community responsibility must always go hand in hand. The case started with a small error in the Amber Alert procedure and the complacency of the repeat offender monitoring system, but those very mistakes caused 2 innocent lives to vanish and took over 20 years to be returned their name. In the United States today, where information spreads in seconds, that lesson is even more vital. A minute's delay in action can cost a child's entire life. Detective Laura Kim's persistence, the one who reopened the old file, shows the power of belief and technology in restoring justice. Without the advances in forensic genealogy and the never-give-up spirit, the truth would perhaps still lie silent beneath the soil by the Mill River. This is a reminder to every American citizen that justice does not come by itself. It requires people who dare to dig deep, who dare to face the mistakes of the past. The case also presents a practical lesson in protecting children and the community. No one thought that a polite man, posing as a charity worker like Donald Sutter, was a predator. In today's life, when social interactions mostly happen online or in public, every parent needs to teach their children how to recognize safety boundaries and trust their instinctive caution. Finally, the Parlow story reminds us that justice may be late, but it is never in vain. It is a testament that America can still correct its mistakes, that a strong society is not one without tragedy, but one where people dare to persist to ensure the truth is told, even if they have to wait 24 years. Thank you for following the journey to find justice for the Parlow sisters, a case that reminds us that the truth can be buried, but it never disappears. Please subscribe to the channel to continue exploring other cold cases with me, where justice, though late, still finds a way to speak out.